Alright guys, so in this video I'm going to be talking you through the content that you're going to need to be aware of for section 1 for assignment unit 30 assignment 1. This video is just going to be going through the actual content that you need to be aware of, which is just going to be enough to get you the pass part of the criteria that this assignment is going to go towards. When we start to think about actually applying these examples or these principles, to real textual examples, that's where your merits and your distinction grades are going to be coming into it. Try actually move the power. There we go. What you're going to be able to have to do in this assignment or in this section of the assignment is basically show an understanding of what some of the different principles of page layout and design are. But more importantly, for you to be looking at merits and distinction grades, it's not just going to be looking at, well, what are these different principles with a few examples. It's looking at, in detail, how you can apply these principles to detailed examples. Alright, so it's basically the application part of the assignment that you need to be thinking about. This bit probably at the bottom is the most important, not just what they are, but how and why are they used. So why might you need to think about these different principles, not just for this assignment, but it's also something that I think you're going to be able to you should be able to be using for any practical work that you do as well, whether that's going to be for your work for Unit 30 Assignment 2, but your Unit 30 exam as well. So these are the things that we're going to be looking at: balance, text alignment, contrast, repetition, proximity, emphasis, grid systems, style and impact, and typography. I've sort of already mentioned this, to be honest, really. So before we start, one of the things that I think I need to be going through, actually before I start, I'll do this bit first. So when we're talking about page layout, design, products, that encompasses quite a wide area, basically. Now, we're not just looking at print products, we're also looking at digital products as well. So for print products, it could be things like posters, like film posters, anything really. Flyers, leaflets, brochures, magazines like the ones you did last year, newspapers, anything that's going to be shown on a physical medium. But we also need to look at digital products as well. So we're going to be looking at things like e-magazines and e-leaflets. So, for example, magazines that have been specifically designed to be read on some sort of digital platform, like an iPad or a tablet or something. But also websites. Websites, web ads, things like the little advertisement banners that you see scrolling across websites. They are all page layout design products. And one thing that we need to be thinking about as well, which is probably something that we're more going to do for section 2 of the assignment, is why products will have different considerations based on what platform it's being made for. So things like why a product that has been specifically designed for the web will have different principles and considerations compared to something that might be designed for a magazine. So when we're talking about the principles of page layout and design, we're basically talking about the rules. Alright, and these are, not to sound like I'm ripping off Pirates of the Caribbean, but these are sort of guidelines or unwritten rules that designers will use to help make their products, look half decent. Any particularly half decent piece of design work will have taken these principles into account before they are made. So even the actual planning process as well. And they will also be considering how these design principles will work with each other. So it's not just thinking about one principle, it's thinking about how one principle might combine with another principle. And what they should do is they should all work together in order to promote a different message, ideal, or style on the reader. So it shouldn't just be done, as a single standalone thing they've got to consider, but they should be all things that combine together to help, what's the word I'm looking for? serve the purpose of what the product is meant to do. Alright, so if you think about something like a print advert, then what you need to be thinking about is how do all these different principles help that advert promote that thing it's meant to promote. And I think having a firm understanding of these principles is not only going to allow you to gain a solid grasp on how products are designed in a specific way, but also to be able to apply them to your own ideas in any future practical design work that you do. And it'll give it a bit more substance. It'll make it look more than just something you've cobbled together. It'll show you've put a little bit of thought into these things. It'll give it a bit more depth to it. So any practical work that you're going to be doing, you should be thinking about these principles and how you could be including them into your own ideas. So we're going to be looking, I've just said this, but just just for clarification, we're going to be looking at balance, alignment, contrast, repetition, proximity, emphasis, grid systems, styles, and impacts, and also typographies as well. There might be a little bit of overlap from some of the stuff we did last year, but that's absolutely fine. So let's crack on with looking at these various principles. Alright, so the first principle we're going to be looking at is balance. Now, balance means the visual weight of all the different elements that you get in a design. Now, when we're talking about elements, we mean things like the objects that you can see on the page. So, for example, this magazine here, you've got a picture, you've got a masthead, you've got your cover lines, you've got your date line, for this poster again, you've got the pictures here, you've got the tagline at the bottom as well. All these different bits of the design are your elements. So when we're talking about balance, we mean the way that these different elements are distributed to make a product seem like it is, arranged equally. Alright, or the way it actually arranged itself to make sure that, no particular side of a design dominates another side of the design. So in order for a design to be balanced, what it needs to do is it needs to find a way of arranging positive elements, so there are things like your objects, your shapes, your text, things like that, and negative space such as your background, your colours, your textures, in a way so that no particular part of the design overbears any or overpowers any other aspects of the design. So it needs to have sort of a nice equally balanced weighting to it. For a design to be balanced, it will need to feel right and everything needs to fit together equally. Now, generally speaking, there are three different kinds of balance that you can be using in your design. You've got symmetrical balance, asymmetrical balance, and radial balance. So, these examples here are arguably examples of symmetrical balance. Now, symmetrical balance is where it's the idea that you can pretty much put a line through the middle of your design, and generally speaking it will almost look pretty much like a mirror image of the other side because it is symmetrical. Alright, the weighting of the objects is pretty much equal on the same side and they're almost identical to each other. So you can see all 6 of these designs here. Yes, they're not exactly identical, but they are more or less pretty much equally weighted on either side, with each side of the page looking almost identical to the other. Therefore, it's symmetrical. Asymmetrical, on the other hand, involves having different elements on either side of a design, but they don't necessarily need to have equal, weighting. Or they can be in a way sort of, not obviously balanced, or they can be completely different shapes. So, for example, if you look at this picture here from the posters of Scorsese's new film Killers of the Flower Moon, this is asymmetrically balanced because there is equal weighting on either side of the poster, but the actual shape of the objects is different. So, for example, on the left-hand side of the page, you've got this big picture of Leonardo DiCaprio's face. However, on the other side, you've got all this text here. You've got the cast, you've got these 2 secondary images here, you've got title as well. Now, these take up pretty much the same amount of space, but they are just filled with a different element that looks very different. So the weighting is the same, therefore it is still balanced, but because it doesn't look like the opposite side, it's asymmetrical. Same with this Vogue magazine here. Not quite as equally balanced as this one, but you've got this big picture of Ariana Grande on the right hand side of the page, and you've got your cover lines down the left, you know? So it is still a balanced design, but it doesn't necessarily need to be balanced with the exact same style of elements. This poster here of Juno, on the left hand side of the page, you've got a picture of 2 characters. On the right hand side of the page, equally balanced, you've got some text on there. Alright, so it is still balanced, it is still organised, but it's just got a little bit more creative flair there. To put it really simply, they are not identical on both sides of a central line, but the weight is pretty much balanced. These designs tend to be a bit less formal, a bit more creative, and a bit more dynamic. So they're the 2 main types of balance that you'll see, but you might also see something called radial balance. Now, radial balance is a little bit more uncommon, but the basic principle of radial balance is that elements will work around a central focus point, and they'll be using circles. So, for example, here, you've got this main element in the middle of the page, this picture of this lady here, and then you've got all these different secondary elements going around that particular central focal point. Therefore, it's radial, it's circular. Same with this one here, you've got this title in the middle and all these different aspects going around the outside as well. It is still balanced, but it's using a different focal point, if that makes sense. Bit more uncommon this one, but it is something that is worth knowing about. So that's what you need to know about for balance. Alright, so the next thing we're going to look at is alignment. Now, alignment refers to how the text, graphics, or any sort of visual element really, anything that you can see on a product, are lined up in a composition in order to allow them to connect to each other. A lot of alignment really comes down to keeping a product nice and organised. It can also make products easier for audiences to understand, especially if it's something that's being presented with a lot of text, for example. But also alignment can be used to create connections between various different elements, such as the combination between text and images, for example. So if you for example look at this Vogue magazine cover in the middle here, you've got the picture of this woman here on the page. Now, you could argue that this text here is aligned quite close to the picture here to allow you to understand that this text is related to this particular image. But a lot of it is down to just pure organisation and professionalism. You know, most professional products will look organised. They'll look very neat. If it's something that is badly organised, it is noticeable. Alright, if something is aligned properly, you're not meant to notice it because you just accept it. Whereas if something is badly organised like this one here, you notice this one here because this is not aligned with all the others. Same with this one here. Alright, you notice this one because it is not aligned with everything else. So if something is badly aligned, it can either be a deliberate choice by the designer or it can be a mistake. Alright, I'd like to hope it's done deliberately for a reason, but you know, you never know. I suppose it depends on what the product actually is. You know, sometimes it can be done just to give like a sense of freedom or something, or to make a product look more dynamic. But it all comes back to the actual context of what is the purpose of the product. Alright, so for example, this one here, this has been deliberately not aligned to make it stand out, to draw your attention towards this. Alright, it's not done by mistake. There are 2 kind of alignments that you need to be aware of. You've got center alignment and edge alignment. Center alignment is where elements, so that could be things like pictures or text or anything like that really, are aligned with the central line of a design. That can either be horizontally or vertically. So these ones here that you can see on screen are all examples of center alignment that use the vertical line as their sort of center margin. So if I was to draw a straight line right down the middle of these designs, all the text elements will be aligned with that central line. So you can see this bit here, draw a line down there, it's all aligned around that middle invisible line. Even this really old poster for a Beatles gig, you know, most of the text on there is centrally aligned. Copy of the Spider-Man poster, Rolling Stones magazine, excuse me. Edge alignment is where elements are aligned with the edges of a page. So if you look at, for example, the cover lines in this magazine here, these cover lines are not aligned with the middle of the page, they're aligned with the edge of the page. You got a nice flat line here around the edge of the page. Doesn't have to be horizontal, it can be vertical as well. Same with this one here, it's aligned with this edge of the page. Same with this film studies textbook, it's aligned with the edge of this page here rather than the middle. Alright? What you probably find is that a lot of text elements on things like newspapers, magazines, things like that, covers, tend to have edge alignments. Again, it's nice and professional looking. You will probably also find that large body copies of text tend to have edge alignment. They're not always, but they can do. Alright? You're more likely to see than you're not going to see, to be honest. There you go. This is an example of what's called justified alignment. Alright? Justified is the term that you would use if you're talking about the... How am I going to explain this? It's where text sits flat on both sides of a text box. So if you look at this example in the middle here, these two columns, you can see that on the edge of both columns, it's nice and flat. Therefore, it's justified. This poster for, I think it's the Bodyguard, the text is flat on both sides. Therefore, it's justified. Alright? Same on this one here. It's flat on both sides. Therefore, it is justified. Doesn't have to be. Alright? There are plenty of examples, skipped ahead there, of body copy of text, that is not justified. So, for example, these ones here, you can see here it's flat on one side, but it's all wavy on the right hand side. This one is the same here as well. So this is unjustified alignment. So this is where the text does not sit flat against both sides, or usually just one side. So you got this one here is the opposite. It's flat on the right hand side of the page, but it's not flat in the middle. So this is unjustified alignment. Text can also be flush left or flush right. Flush left is where the text sits flat against the left side of the margin with a soft right margin, and flush right is the opposite. Most text you see will be flush left because that's how we write, but you will also sometimes see things that are flush right as well. It's less common to be flush right, but you might see it on things like posters, you might see it on magazine front covers, you might see it on newspapers, for example. Generally, it's not really something you'd see for things like body copy, and you would only really see this where a piece of text is on the right hand side of a page or the right hand side of an object. Alright, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense as to why it's flush right if it's not on the right hand side of a page. So that's all we really need to know about alignment. The majority of it is down to text. So when you're looking for your examples, if you want to talk about alignment, pay particular attention to the text of whatever product it is you are looking at, and have a think about how the text is aligned. Is it deliberately aligned? Why? Is it to make it try and look professional? To make it look neat? To make it look tidy? Or is it deliberately not aligned in order to, for a specific reason, for example? So that's all we need to look at for alignment. Alright, so contrast is quite a simple one to get your head round, but it refers to having different design elements that are dramatically different to one another in order to create a clear difference between them. Now, sometimes they can be really subtle, but sometimes they can be quite significant. When we're looking at contrast, there are a few different ways, or common ways, that you can achieve contrast in your designs. So the ones we're going to look at in particular today are size, value, colour, type, and a couple of other random elements as well. When you're thinking of contrast though, you've always got to be thinking, okay, well, why do you want to create a contrast? What's the point in that? Why do you really specifically want to have these two different contrasting elements, opposing each other? What's the purpose? What's the reasons? So size is quite an easy one to get your head around at first. The contrasting size of different elements, they can draw audiences' attention towards certain things first. Our eyes are usually more naturally drawn to the largest parts of an image. Therefore, we'll read that one first. So, sometimes people will contrast the size of different elements in order to make sure the audience's attentions are drawn to the thing that they want them to be drawn towards instead of other aspects first. So, for example, this one here, he says, you will read this first, then you read this, then this one, and then you read this one. The reason why we read this first is because it's the biggest. Alright, this is contrasted against all these other elements to make sure you read it first. Same with this. In terms of text, 1917 is the biggest piece of text on there. Therefore, the contrast that this text has with these pieces of text is going to make sure that we read it first. When we talk about value, we're talking about how light and dark different parts of images or posters could be. And again, that can be used to help create contrast as well. So, for example, this one here, you've got quite a dark shade of blue around the outside of the image. Again, nice little bit of radial balance there. And in the middle, you've got the very light blue, almost even going to white a little bit in the middle as well, creating a nice contrast. Really famous poster from The Exorcist, you've got black surrounding the outside of this poster, but then it's really harsh white in the middle to serve as a nice contrast between those different elements. Colour is a really easy way to help create contrast. Colour choices are arguably probably the most important thing that you need to understand when creating a design. Choosing the right colours can have a massive impact on the overall aesthetic of your design, and it's much more simple than just doing something like black and white. Colours can help create balance, or they can create contrast, but they're also really useful when you're thinking about what those colours might suggest, what they might connote. So, for example, a couple of years ago, for our Unit 30 Pro, we made loads of posters for the college production of Chicago. And when we were looking at the aesthetic style of Chicago, we noticed that the posters tend to have a lot of reds. And the reason why was because, the show has themes of things like murder and betrayal in there. So the red was a good colour choice to use because it suggested the whole idea of betrayal and blood and violence. But also it had a lot of gold in there as well. And gold suggests things like richness and wealth and excess, which again are other themes that the show touches upon. So colour choices is really important. You want to make sure that your colours, you don't really want colours to conflict with each other, because certain colours do go well with each other, certain colours don't. So, this is back to what I was saying before actually about colour connotations. So again, you've got this NHS leaflet here, which chooses to have a nice blue calming tone, because if you're reading a pamphlet that is on some emergency health issue, you don't want to fill it with aggressive colours, because it's probably going to make you have a heart attack or something. This one here in the middle, you could argue use these colour choices because it wants to aim at younger audiences, therefore it uses simple, bright, vibrant colours. This one here, the danger warning, so it's got this bright red contrasting with the rest of the design to help you be aware of what hazards electricity can cause. But colour can also, conflict with each other as well. Okay, I don't really need to explain that, to be honest, do I really? But it can give you severe migraines. So be careful with your colour choices. good thing to look at is to Google matching colours. You know, these are colours that all go well with each other. Sometimes you can use these little colour palettes here. So if you're ever looking at what sort of colours you could potentially use for your designs, Google some colour palettes. You know, these will help you find colours that complement each other. You know, colours that provide a nice contrast that don't make your eyeballs bleed. Alright? There are other types of contrast you can do as well. Shapes, for example, can be quite useful. Different typographies, which we'll go over a little bit more, but even things like the content of the image as well. You know, two contrasting images can help create a contrast with each other. You know, two images that are, you know, they might be similar shapes, or they might be similar, you know, I don't know, sizes maybe, but the actual content of what the image is can help create contrast. But that's, I mean, they're sort of the main ones for contrast. Colours, you know, size, what am I talking about? Colours, value, and size. Yeah, they're the main things really you want to focus on for how you can create contrast in your designs. But the most important thing is thinking about why do you want to make contrast, or why does this element need to contrast with that element? Is it clear just to make it stand out more, or is it for a certain reason? Alright, so that's it for contrast. Okay, so repetition is an important aspect when you're thinking about how you're going to create a sense of familiarity with your products for your audiences. Whilst it can refer to using the same elements repeatedly on the same design, it's more commonly seen when you're using the same design elements over either a series of different products or throughout numerous pages. So you all probably did this last year when you were thinking of the house style for your magazines. So magazines, newspapers and websites are really good examples of this, because they will generally tend to use the same, or repeat, the same style, generally speaking, over and over and over again, in order to make sure that their audience are familiar with their design, almost so that eventually audiences will become, you know, they will associate that style with that brand. So if you look at, these copies of Vanity Fair here, generally speaking, they all have the same repeated style. You've got masthead in the upper third of the page. You've got a medium close-up shot, or in this case a medium long shot. They're generally speaking medium to medium close-up shot of some celebrity on the front page. You have got one, or generally speaking, you've got one splash story, you know, one larger cover line and a series of secondary cover lines surrounding the image, you know. So they all have a similar fonts as well. You know, even the fact that they all generally tend to be using serif fonts on their front page as well. Same with Grand Designs, you know, pretty similar, pretty much exactly the same style for every single front page. And what that will allow audiences to do is to recognise that style and become familiar, because it's repeated across several different products. It will allow them for that sense of familiarity. It's not just front pages though. These are all pages taken from different copies of Empire magazine. So you've got the same style for the same section throughout different issues of the magazine. But again, it allows people to understand what that house style is, so they'll become familiar with it. You know, they'll recognise it. They'll be able to know that they'll be able to associate that repeated style with that particular product. Again, websites are a good example of this. There are some more pages from Empire here. Alright, generally speaking, websites, if you have numerous pages within one website, they will use the same style on each page, you know, to give that sense of, or to create that sense of familiarity and I suppose comfort, really. You know, if you as an audience member is looking at the same style over and over and over again, within one product, it's going to make things easier to understand because you'll be able to recognize it and you'll be able to you're familiar with it. You're not adjusting to a completely new concept on the next page. So repetition, really important to think about as well. There you go. These are all taken from leaflets from the Book of Mormon. Same fonts, same color schemes, same font styles, same pictures-ish, generally speaking. Again, you've got a nice sense of familiarity there, and it allows you to become familiar with that particular style. So repetition, quite a simple one, but an important one to think of nevertheless. Okay, so proximity refers to the placement of related items and their distance away from other objects. Closer proximity means that elements placed near each other, or in some cases overlapping each other, are related in some way or connected with with the thing that they're close to. Unrelated items are generally placed further away. So if you look at this example of this cover of Billboard, you've got this picture of Bruno Mars here, and you've got the text Bruno Mars. Now what's significant about the text is it's so close to the actual object, it even goes behind him. So what that will allow, if you've got no idea who Bruno Mars is, you're lucky, but also it means that you will be able to assume that this text here is to do with this fella here because of the proximity between the object and the text, whereas these ones here, there's a little bit of negative space you've got, or white space as it's called, between these two objects. So you are more likely to associate this text with this person. Splash stories are a really good example of this, and newspaper front covers as well. Most of the time the main headline on a newspaper front page will be next to the image. It can be ineffective, for example. So if again you look at these two images here, you've got this big headline here, I could have helped prevent the Iraq War, next to a picture of Tom Jones. The close proximity of these two things makes it look like Tom Jones could have helped prevent the Iraq War, which would be unlikely, not unusual, but unlikely. Captions are a good example of this. Again, this is something I'm sure you all did when you did your magazine pages last year. You would have put a caption underneath the image. If you would put that caption further away from the image that it relates to, you probably, or the reader, probably wouldn't be able to understand that that caption is specifically related to that image. So captions, again, are good examples of text or proximity. The closer things are to each other, the idea that readers will get from that is that these particular objects are related to each other in some way. There's some connection there. And any space that is between objects is called white space. So this space here doesn't need to be white. This space here is called white space. So it doesn't mean the colour, but it refers to the space between objects and is used to create groupings and connections. Alright, anything negative there. Okay, that's quite a simple one for proximity, really. Alright, so the next thing we're going to look at is emphasis. Emphasis is where designers will attempt to draw the viewer's attention towards a specific design element. This can sometimes be referred to as dominance. But it can also be used to create what's called a visual hierarchy. Now that means you want to emphasize the importance of a particular element. So for example, titles or headlines, things like that. So to emphasize something can sometimes be used to help create that sense of importance or that sense of hierarchy. To understand emphasis, you need to understand hierarchy. So the literal definition means a ranking or a ranking of status or importance. And the basic idea really is the bigger the object, the more important that particular object is. So size can be a good way of creating emphasis, because our eyes are normally drawn towards the larger parts of a design first. Generally speaking, that is one of the main ways, but it doesn't have to be. Colour can sometimes be a good way of creating emphasis. I mean, look at that front cover of the Daily Mirror you've got there. Why have they deliberately chosen to put the word they and 13 years in yellow? And the simple answer is it creates emphasis. So rather than saying, but we all know it's 13 years of this lot, it says, but we all know it is 13 years of this lot. And then rather than saying they broke our NHS, it's saying they broke our NHS. So just by changing the colour there, it emphasises that particular word. So generally speaking, size is the most common way of creating emphasis, but there can be other techniques. Sometimes text might even do things like put something in bold, or they might put something, they'll do it underlined, or they'll put it in italics, or they will, do it a different font, maybe, But generally speaking, size is the most common way of how you might emphasise something, but not necessarily. Alright, next up we've got grid systems. Now again, this is something that you will all have done last year when you made your magazine pages. So, designers will always use grid systems to help make sure their designs are organised and neat. So, margins and bleeds are ones that you definitely will have used last year. You'll see this in numerous different page layout and design products. So margins, there is a difference between a margin and a bleed. So a margin is the space around the edge of the page to ensure a neat and tidy design. So it's the gap between generally the text and the edge of the page. It's almost like a safety gap. Traditionally, this was to ensure that when you printed a product, you didn't lose any text if the cutting of the paper was not smooth. So you would always leave a little bit of a safety margin around the outside to, to make sure there's no cut off for any parts of the product. Certainly with text. Bleed, for example, is almost like the opposite of that. So bleed refers to the amount of overlap a design will have to make sure that there is no, there's no edge to the page. Again, it comes back to the whole idea of the actual printing finish of the product. So it means that if you let's say had this picture here of Mark on some double page spread, when you make this design on InDesign or whatever you use, you will overlap the picture over the edge of the page just as a safety precaution in case there's any issues when it's printed off. And how much you go over the edge of the page is your bleed. Alright, so it's almost like a reverse safety margin, but it's mainly something that you use for things like textures instead. Columns as well is something you need to think about. In design, large body copy text is often presented in columns rather than in one block text. It makes it much easier for the audience to read. So this example here has got 2 columns of text running vertically from top to bottom and then left to right as well. They might, but not always, use things like drop caps or drop capitals to indicate to the reader where the body copy will begin, but this is mainly something you only really see in magazines, so it's not necessarily something you see in things like newspapers. They will use different techniques. The space between the columns as well is called the guttering. Alright, and the size of the guttering will impact on how readable the text is between those 2 columns. If the guttering is too small, it will mean the text will look very cramped. If it's too big, it might look a little bit bare. What else have we got? Oops. There are some magazines or some products though that will deliberately choose to abandon these grid systems and go for a design that is deliberately unconventional. Now, this is usually done for very specific aesthetic reasons. Sometimes it can just be because it looks cool. Maybe this product wants to be more artistic. It wants something that's a bit more expressionistic. It wants to do something that's challenging to the audience. So some designs will deliberately choose to reject these grid systems. This is a magazine called Raygun, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was very famous for having unconventional designs, making it really challenging for the reader to, read, obviously. But generally speaking, these are the grid systems that designers will use: margins and bleeds, columns, and guttering. Alright, so the next thing we need to look at is style and impact. So, focal points are a very common method that designers will use in order to draw audience's attention to a certain point on the design and grab their attention. So it could be, things like, a piece of text or an image or a button, for example, if it's a website maybe, etc., etc. Techniques such as size, colours, fonts, positioning, balance, all those different techniques that we have gone through can be used to help create a focal point. So, for example, if you look at that Matilda poster, you can see the focal point of that is clearly meant to be the character of Matilda in the middle of the page. So you might think, okay, well, how does it do that? Well, one of the obvious examples you can see there is, first of all, the contrast, because you've got a contrast in tone there, haven't you, between the white image and the darker shadowy image of the character, but also you've got a little bit of radial balance in there as well. So these techniques that we've just looked at, can help create a focal point to an image, that links back to what I was saying at the start of the video, where you need to be thinking about how all these different principles, work together to help create certain effects or meanings or whatever it is the product is intending to do. So focal points is quite a simple one. Now where it gets complicated is where you start to move on to other aspects or other techniques that designers will use to help create structure. This first one's not that complicated because you should have used this last year, and this is the rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds is the idea that a canvas can be split into 3 even rows and 3 even columns. And the sections where the line meet are the hot spots of design where our eyes are more naturally drawn towards. So you've got these sections here in the middle. So what you'll tend to find is that important elements are often placed in and around those particular points because that's where our eyes are more naturally going to go to. But the rule of thirds can also be used to help maintain balance as well. So you can see here, with the exception of these top 2 sections up here, most of these thirds or ninths, of this page have more or less the same amount of content within them or elements in them, so it looks nice and balanced. This one here, all these different ninths of the page all have more or less the same amount of elements within them to help maintain a nice, organized, balanced focus. Now, the golden ratio is a tricky concept, but it is often used by designers to help with layouts and typography choices and things like that. So, it's a mathematical equation, and it's something that is built into nature as well as, digital design. Alright? I'm not going to go into too much detail on it because it is pretty complicated and I don't want to confuse you too much. But if you want to do a bit more research, please feel free to Google it, but it might make your brain melt. So, the idea behind the golden ratio comes from something called the Fibonacci sequence, which I'm not going to go into right now because I only got a C in maths and, it's complicated. But if you want to Google it, go for it. And the idea behind the golden ratio basically is the idea that inferior elements on a page should be 1.618 times smaller than the previous elements that preceded it in terms of its importance. So for example, if you've got the most important element on your page, for example a title or a picture, whatever it is, the element on that page that is the second most important element should be 1.618 times smaller than that element. Alright, hopefully it'll make a bit more sense when I start to go through typographies. So I hope that makes sense, right? So let's look at this example here. So if you look at this idea of the golden ratio, you've got your main content of design here. This could be a picture or a text. All this content here is supporting content. So it might be main picture, secondary picture, secondary picture, secondary picture, bit of text, whatever. Each section that you follow on the golden ratio is 1.68 times smaller than the subsequent section. Okay? So you've got some examples here from websites. This bit here, really important part of this website for someone who wants to buy some sweatpants for €85. Bloody hell, I never noticed that. Wow. Anyway, but then you've got this section here, bit smaller, bit smaller, bit smaller, bit smaller, bit smaller. Same with this one here. Okay? The same can be said for typography sizes as well. Alright, but layouts will use the golden ratio because the idea behind it is it makes your design feel organic, because the golden ratio is something that exists in nature. So it feels like a very natural way to lay out a design. And when you apply it, it does resemble a spiral. Now, if you've seen the film Glass Onion, you might have seen the golden ratio within it. If you know about the golden ratio, it can help you work out the twist at the end of that film. So if you have seen the Glass Onion, then you can use it to help figure out the twist. And if you haven't seen Glass Onion, watch it, it's pretty good, but you should be able to work out the twist of the film if you know about the golden ratio. Okay? The other thing you've got to look at is the capital F rule, which is something that websites will often use. This is where the structure of design resembles a capital F. Alright, it's commonly seen on websites. And again, it follows it's the idea that these are directions our eyes travel when we read something. So that's how the content is laid out. Alright? But the main one for me, I think, is the rule of thirds and the golden ratio. They're the ones I think are particularly important to get your head around. But the golden ratio can be a little bit complicated. But there's some stuff that I need to go through in typographies that might hopefully make the golden ratio a little bit easier to understand. But the basic premise of it is, your important elements and your supporting elements decrease in size by a particular amount, depending on how important those objects are. Right, now a common misconception is that typography is just referring to the type of font or typeface that has been used for a product. And whilst that is something that you do need to consider, there are other things you need to think about as well when you're thinking about typography as a whole. So other things that you need to be thinking about are going to be things like the actual font size, how that font relates to a particular brand, whether the font is legible or not, but also the objectives of the text as well. Why might the actual purpose of that text, why might that font you've used, or the size or whatever, relate to what the actual point of that text is there to do? What's the actual purpose of it? So, size is a pretty easy concept to get your head around at first. So the idea is the bigger the text, which we've already looked at for emphasis, is the bigger the text, the more important the piece of text is. Hence why titles or cover lines or headlines are usually the most important piece of text on the design. The size, I had sort of mentioned this a minute ago, the size of a typeface is an easy way of creating emphasis. Alright, the bigger the piece of text is, you know, the more important it's going to be. So for example, you've got the Barbie poster on the left hand side. Obviously the most important piece of text is the title Barbie, hence why it's the biggest. The Trafford College Prospectus course guide is the biggest piece of text on there because it is a title, therefore it's important. You can use the golden ratio in typographies to help create emphasis. So for example, all of these fonts here are 1.618 times the original font size, and you know, it is a nice little way of making a piece of text seem more important. So that's a good little rule of thumb to use if you're doing text on a design. You know, whatever size font your most important piece of text is, let's say it's, I don't know, I'm not going to bother doing some math, ignore me. Your second most important piece of text should be 1.618 times the smaller than that font size underneath. I didn't explain that very well. You get the idea. Branding is also a really important thing to consider when you're thinking of typographies. You've got to be thinking about how suitable is that typeface for the brand or the kind of product it is you're using. Is it suitable? Is it appropriate? You know, does it embody the right spirit? So for example, you can see the CBeebies uses very much a bubble style font in order to appeal to younger audiences. That Classic FM logo uses a very traditional serif font to create that traditional, classic-y, old-fashioned sort of feel to it, which is very suitable for Classic FM. You know, the nature of the brand. So you got to be thinking about, is the actual typeface that I've used actually going to be appropriate? I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I had someone who wanted to make a dance magazine for their Unit 14 work, and when they were doing their typography designs, they did what, and we're talking like a classic dancing, like ballet sort of magazine, not like contemporary really. And the typeface they chose to use for one of their master designs was written in fire. Therefore, probably not that suitable for the actual branding of the product. Legibility. This means how readable the font is. Alright? It doesn't just mean the font itself, but in relation to the purpose. You know, so for example, yes, you could find fonts that are, you know, borderline unreadable, like the ones on the board, but it also could be the actual size of the font. You know, if something is important and it's too small, therefore it's not going to be legible. You know, it's not going to be readable, is it really? You also need to consider, you know, what the piece of text is meant to do. What's the purpose? What's his job? And how will that impact on the typography choices? So, skipped a slide, haven't I? So, there are 6 typography choices in the example on the screen. And that's because each of these typography choices serves a different purpose. So you need to be thinking about, okay, well, what is this piece of text? What's it designed to do, and how will that impact on the choice of typography that I use? You know, you've got this one here, the bold display font is a title. This one here is in italics because it's a subhead or a deck. This one here, a bit smaller, all in capitals because it's a byline. This one here is in a black circle because it's almost like a bullet point. This one here is in blue because it's a subhead and it's bold. And this one here is in is a serif font because it's body copy. So all of these are different typefaces because they have different purposes. So that again is something that you will need to consider. In terms of typographies or types, the ones that you need to be aware of are serif fonts, sans serif fonts, scripts, and display fonts. There are others, but these are the main ones. So a serif font, a serif is a flick or a line that appears at the end of a character. So a serif font is a font that includes these flicks. You can see examples on the screen. So that's an example of a serif font here. You know, it's got these. I've got some more, and I'm sure I've got some more on there. No, never mind. So you can see example. This is an example of a serif font. These are very traditional fonts. These are fonts that you generally tend to see in large bodies of text. So things like articles, for example, or text in a book. Not universally, but traditionally. They're very sophisticated. They're very formal. They're very professional, you could say. Sans serif fonts, though, they don't have those flicks. So sans is French for without, so a sans serif font means it was without the flicks. These are much more modern fonts. They're very clean. They're often used for display purposes, but you are starting to see them creep more into body copies, especially in magazines. But traditionally, they are not used for those sorts of things, but you do see them now and again. You do sometimes see serif fonts on fashion magazine cover lines on front covers as well. Script fonts are fonts that are designed to mimic handwriting. They're often used to make something feel personalised, to make it feel authentic. You know, they can be very formal or traditional, but they can be quite relaxed and personal too. I suppose that depends on what the product is. But they can also, if it's very neat, old-fashioned handwriting, it can be used to create a sense of old-fashioned feel as well. Display fonts are fonts that are meant to be used for display purposes. They're usually bold, usually very chunky as well. They're usually sort of something that's designed to be read from a distance. Okay. When you're thinking of your typeface, you need to be thinking of how appropriate it is as well. You know, does that typeface have certain connotations? You know, does it have any associations with things? So, for example, if you're using an old-fashioned font, something like there's no examples on here, is there really? Never mind. It wouldn't be suitable for a product that was aimed at modern audiences or younger audiences, for example. So the actual type you use is really important. Last thing is the kerning, the leading, and the tracking. Now, I always get these things mixed up, and you probably will too. So kerning relates to the space between individual letters, right? So that space there. Leading is the horizontal space between two words. So this space here is leading, and this space here is leading, and the space that you would see between these letters is the leading. And tracking is the space between the individual letters in an entire word. So all these spaces here is tracking. So kerning is this one space here, the space between ker and ning. Tracking is all these spaces between the individual letters. And that's pretty much all you need to know about typography, really.